Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, everybody knows it's all over the news every day, the war that's taking place in Israel and in Gaza. And I keep coming across this idea that Israel supported Hamas or Israel propped up Hamas. And this argument is buttressed by a shared quote from Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. And so I looked for the source of the quote, and it turns out it's from an article in 2019 in the Jerusalem Post, and I've invited the article's author on. Her name is Lahav Harkov. She's here with us, and we are very grateful to have her. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so let me just find this quote. I want to read the quote to you. It says, this is from Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's at a Likud fundraiser or some such thing.
Well, it's right? Like the weekly, I'll just say the way the Knesset works, right? There's multiple parties. It's not like in Congress where you have two parties and a few independents. And they have like a weekly, the parties have these have weekly meetings where they coordinate the legislative agenda for the week. And usually they make some sort of public statement in the beginning, the head of the party. But this wasn't the part that was behind closed doors. So the quote is the quote that somebody else who was in the room, because there were no journalists in the room, told me. And I make that clear in the article, but I think people should know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't have a direct quote from Netanyahu.
Well, that's what I'm getting to, because wherever I read it, this is how it's read. Whoever is against the Palestinian state should be for transferring the funds to Gaza, because maintaining a separation between the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza helps prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So that's my first question. That is not an exact quote, correct?
Correct. It's not a direct quote from Netanyahu. It's a quote from someone in the room who heard Netanyahu say, he's paraphrasing Netanyahu, right? Like, I don't think he was taking exact notes. And then somebody else who was there confirmed it for me.
Okay. Now, I saw a guy doing an interview, and he said that this is 100% that Netanyahu said this. Are you 100% certain that Netanyahu said this? Or something akin to it? I mean, I know it's not a direct quote.
Look, when you're relying on sources in the room and you're not in the room, there is no 100%. But I wouldn't have written it in the newspaper if it wasn't from someone I trust.
Right.
So, I had enough confidence in it, and I checked it with a second person to write it. And I'll say also, I don't think the articles in English are citing this as much, but Chaim Ramon, who's a former government minister.
That was my next question.
Apparently, I have not read his memoir, but according to Haaretz, which is, a major newspaper in English, he said that Netanyahu said something similar that he heard.
Is there any chance that he got that from your article?
It's a good question. I don't know when his memoir was published.
2021, I believe.
So then it's possible. I'm trying to remember, because the Jerusalem Post is in English. I write in English. We have a sister publication called Ma'ariv that's in Hebrew, and I don't remember if they translated it or not, because we don't have the exact same material, but sometimes we borrow from each other and translate. And I'm not sure.
Okay, so
I mean, he could read English too. I'm not sure that he reads the Jerusalem Post. I don't know.
Okay, so the basic claim here is that Israel and Netanyahu have been, a phrase used frequently is propping up, or they're funding Hamas. Is this true? Is that what's going on?
No, it's not what's going on at all. You look like you have another question. That's why
No. I was hoping you were going to elaborate, but I was going to ask you to anyway. But go ahead.
There's a lot of context to this statement in 2019. Okay, so basically, 2019 was a time when Hamas was sending these fire balloons, and they were setting all kinds of things on fire and just launching them over the fence into Israel, where all these kibbutzes, they're agricultural communities, and it was burning down fields where wheat was being grown, or fruit, or etc., things that Israelis need to eat. And so it wasn't necessarily hurting people, but it was a problem for Israel. Nobody wants it to be happening. And in the meantime, there was continuing to be money sent from Qatar into Gaza. Now, Qatar, they say all the money goes to humanitarian needs, and they were coordinating it with Israel. By 2019, that had been going on for, I think, 6 years already. It was coordinated with Israel so that Israel would make sure that, all the supplies that were getting in were actually humanitarian goods and not like, weapons being smuggled in. And then Israel would make sure that the money would go to humanitarian agencies and not directly to Hamas and things like that. And while Hamas was attacking Israel on a daily basis at that point, there were, a lot of politicians in Netanyahu's party and other parties were complaining and saying, well, why are we letting Hamas get all this money when they're attacking us? Now, there's Netanyahu gives two answers, right? He says the fact that the money is being coordinated with us, it means that it's less, it's more likely to actually go to food and medicine and fuel and whatever humanitarian needs they have, as opposed to it going to terrorism. Now, I think the argument that many people on the right make, and it's a strong argument, is that money is fungible, right? Like if Hamas doesn't have to spend its own taxes that it collects from Gazans, then now it has more money to spend on attacking Israel. And the other thing is also, some people make the argument that the worse things get for people in Gaza, the more likely it is that they'll stand up to Hamas and try to overthrow them as rulers, which I would say life was not that amazing in Gaza and they never did it. So I don't know how strong that argument is, but those are the sort of two arguments people make. In any case, Israel was never sending money to Gaza, and certainly not to Hamas. Israel was coordinating humanitarian aid that was sent from Qatar to Gaza.
And had they not allowed that, the same people who are now criticizing Israel for facilitating the payments likely would have been criticizing them for blocking humanitarian aid. I mean, that's absolutely that's how I see it anyway.
And they're probably criticizing Israel right now for not letting in enough humanitarian aid during the war. And by the way, when there was a government in Israel not led by Netanyahu in the last few years, for about a year and a half, they went around in Israel and they boasted. They said, we're not letting suitcases full of cash be sent to Gaza anymore. The money just went through Egypt. So it wasn't like, Hamas wasn't getting the money.
Yeah, it was just coming through a different route. So was it ever the policy, the idea from that the argument is made is that by supporting Hamas, propping up Hamas, then you basically prevent there being a Palestinian state, because the PLO or the Palestinian Authority doesn't get to gain control. You don't have a state. I'm probably messing that up a little bit, but basically the argument is by propping up Hamas, you prevent a Palestinian state from coming into being. Was that ever the actual strategy? In other words, the paraphrased quote from Netanyahu, was that ever actual policy?
To me, it sounded like, if you take it in the full context and know the background of the situation, to me, it sounds like he's telling people in his party, because Likud opposes a Palestinian state, he's saying, by the way, this is an added bonus of the situation, because they were complaining about the situation, right? He's appealing. These are people who are more right-wing than Netanyahu, saying Netanyahu is not right-wing enough. And Netanyahu is saying to them, here's the right-wing argument, which is that if you don't want a Palestinian state, this keeps the Palestinians divided. I don't think it was the logic to begin with. Now, the background that's important to know is that the Palestinian Authority was already out of control of Gaza before this money started going in from Qatar to Gaza. Right. In 2006, there were elections held for the Parliament of Gaza, and Hamas won the majority. And they immediately started killing Fatah people. Fatah is the party that dominates the Palestinian Authority, which also has not held elections in many, many years. And so the Palestinian Authority lost control because the terrorist organization that runs Gaza, drove them out. So they were already divided. But, there's an argument to be made that if Israel had starved Gaza and then people maybe would have overthrown Hamas, then the Palestinian Authority could have come in. It's a very speculative, a lot, one what if on top of another what if on top of another what if, but you could make that argument.
So the claims, the arguments being made that I'm seeing that are presenting this is, first of all, that quote is 100% certain that this policy, it's 100% certain that this was the policy that Israel was pursuing, the divide and conquer, to state that as if you know that 100% is just false. Nobody knows that for
Correct.
100%.
By the way, Netanyahu himself has addressed this claim a few times in recent weeks. Like, I guess there's been enough, chatter about it in the media that he felt like he needed to address it. And his argument, which also is true, is that if he was propping up Hamas, why would he have had so many military operations against Hamas while he was prime minister, right? Starting, in 2012 and in 2014, and also in the last few years, there were several sort of smaller ones in the last few years. So why would someone who's propping up Hamas be bombing them?
Right. Somebody actually said to me that this idea is 100% accepted by everyone. They said it's even accepted by the Times of Israel. So I went and I looked at the Times of Israel article, and it wasn't actually an article; it was an op-ed piece. So
look. There was an ongoing left-wing criticism of Netanyahu that he should have strengthened the Palestinian Authority and done things to prop up the Palestinian Authority more, and that would have weakened Hamas, right? And I think Netanyahu's argument would be, trying to steelman Netanyahu, is that the Palestinian Authority are not really our friends either. So I'm not going to help anyone. I'm not helping the Palestinian Authority, and I'm not helping Hamas really. And they can figure out, the Palestinians can work out their own problems, but the Israeli left and including some of the moderate left has said, if the Palestinian Authority are people who we can work with more than Hamas, not that you can work with not that Israel has had so much success working with the Palestinian Authority, but it's a little bit more workable than Hamas, then we should encourage them more, right? So I think that people are taking that argument and twisting it.
And what is Netanyahu's position on a Palestinian state? Is he totally opposed to there ever being a Palestinian state?
So there have been a few times that Netanyahu has accepted some version of a Palestinian state. In 2009, he gave what's been known as the Bar-Ilan speech, where he said he would accept a demilitarized Palestinian state. And it wouldn't be the entire West Bank, is the major. Well, at the time, Netanyahu said no one would have to leave their home. So it would be that all settlements would remain. The map looks a bit different now, so I don't know what he would say exactly. But in any case, he's okay with a demilitarized Palestinian state and for Israel to continue to have a military presence along the Jordan River. And that was also basically the case in President Trump's plan for the region, which would have involved limiting settlements to certain blocks. That map was sort of never finalized. But, there's like this story that Netanyahu has told, that when Netanyahu proposed in his 2009 speech the demilitarized Palestinian state with Israel having that military presence right, between the Palestinian state and Jordan, basically, then Vice President Joe Biden said to him, that's not really a state. And Netanyahu said, well, call it whatever you want.
Okay, so in addition to the idea that Netanyahu and Israel have been propping up Hamas, there's also this claim that Israel created Hamas. Now, I've looked into this a little bit, and it seems like initially there was some people that were developing over there, and the Israeli government thought that they were going to be more peaceful and more easy to deal with, and then they turned into Hamas. But there's conflicting sources. Do you know anything about this, the claim that Israel created Hamas?
Basically, in the 80s, right, there was like a budding sort of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated Islamist group in Gaza, what eventually became Hamas. And they started out the way the Muslim Brotherhood does in many places, with mosques and schools, like sort of civil programs, very focused on religious things. And then they sort of move into the political realm. When they were an educational and religious group, the Israeli military government of Gaza, right, which at the time that was a thing, right? Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, so that's not the case now. But at the time, right, you couldn't, if Israel wanted to put the kibosh on these mosques and schools, Israel had the power to do that, and Israel didn't do it. And in fact, there were some in the sort of military government of Gaza that thought that, like you said, that Hamas would be sort of better people to work with. And that's basically what it is. And again, it's another one of these cases where Israel wasn't giving them money, but they were allowing money to be given to them. They weren't a violent group. They weren't a terrorist group at the time. I mean,
Okay.
that is
So there's nothing
probably the
nefarious
plan, but it wasn't. Not that I could tell. Now there's like an interview with I don't remember the name anymore, but like an IDF military officer in Gaza at the time, who I think was figuratively saying, because when you read it in the context of the interview, like, oh, we created Hamas, like we could have nipped it in the bud and we didn't.
And so Israel's critics take that statement and run with it.
To take it literally, yeah.
Okay, I read in an article in this magazine I just heard of, Plus 972, and they said that they were interviewing somebody in the Israeli army, claiming that the Israelis were being instructed to target civilians. Is that something that should be taken? They didn't name the person that was the source. I don't know how reputable that is. Is that something to be taken seriously? Is there a real chance that the Israeli government or the Israeli armed forces are being commanded to target civilians?
No, there's no chance that that's happening. I don't consider 972 to be a reputable source, but does it happen that Israel strikes a building where there are terrorist targets and there are civilians in the building? Yes. But also it often happens that when Israel is going to strike a building and it sees that there are civilians there, or that there are people there that it didn't expect to be there, that they call off the strike. And so, war is messy, and many, many tragedies and accidents occur, but it is absolutely not something that the IDF does command people to shoot civilians, who are not committing acts of terror.
Now, I want people to understand that you're not some Netanyahu apologist. What are your thoughts on the policy of allowing the Qatari money to come into Gaza?
Like, I have very mixed feelings about it. I think Hamas was allowed to balloon into this power to be considered into an almost legitimate government of Gaza, and that was part of the problem that that led Israel to be so deluded that it completely missed some of the very obvious intelligence signals that Hamas was planning an attack on Israel. So first of all, it ultimately strengthened Hamas, and that has been really bad for Israel's security. But at the same time, I don't want the people of Gaza to starve, or to not have electricity, or to not have clean water. So there needs to be some way. First of all, it would be better if the Palestinians in Gaza had leadership that allowed them to develop a normal economy so that they could afford those things themselves. But in lieu of that, I suppose there has to be a way for humanitarian aid to get to them so that they don't starve, so that they do have clean water and sewage, etc. So it has to come from somewhere, that money and that aid. The UN has done a really bad job keeping things out of Hamas's hands. So I don't know what the solution is, right? So that's why I have mixed feelings about it. I don't think that we can say no money at all should get into Gaza.
How is you live in Israel, correct?
Yes.
How has life changed since the October 7th attacks? Is it where you are? Is it just as it always was, or are things considerably different? I don't know much about Israeli geography. I don't know where you are, so I don't know. Is it affecting everybody, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I think everybody is affected in some way. I live in a really weird pocket. I live in a city that's about midway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And somehow, while Hamas is they don't have precise aim, they don't have precision weapons, but while they're generally aiming in the direction of these big cities, they somehow missed my city almost entirely. It's strange. So I don't have a lot of sitting in the shelter, running away from rockets and things like that. But everybody knows somebody who knows somebody, you know, whether it's somebody who was killed or someone who was taken hostage. And it's like the city, or just Israeli life generally, like you feel like the young men have all disappeared, because like over 300,000 people have been called up for reserve duty. My husband's one of them. I have 3 small children, so I've been sort of, you know, at home alone with 3 small children for 2 months now. Israel's a very small country, so he's been able to visit. It's not like, you know, when you're in America and people go off to Iraq, but it's still, you know, my story is the story of many, many mothers across Israel. So everyone feels affected in some way. It's not like, you know, I've lived in Israel most of my life, but I grew up in the US, and I was living in the US when the Iraq war started, and I don't think I know anyone who fought in the Iraq war, right? So it's not like that where there was a war happening far away and my country was at war, but I barely felt it in my life. It's very different in Israel. Everyone feels it.
I can see the emotion in you just talking about this subject. Wow, it must be something. Netanyahu is committed to eradicating Hamas. He says he's going to get rid of them. But from my perspective, we've got these ceasefires now that are taking place to allow aid to come in. They're having more and more talks. It seems like it's just going to be what's always the case, where the will is just lost. The international pressure gets to them and they're not going to do it. What are you seeing on the ground with your connections, whatever? Is the government of Israel going to see through this, commit to the course, and defeat Hamas?
So first of all, I think that like the Israeli public, and that includes like the left and the right, it's like almost across the board. You know, you have extremes and whatever, but most people are really determined to see this through. I mean, the sense in Israel is that the threat from Hamas, like Israel allowed, they used to say that it was drizzling, that we would have drizzles of rockets, right? And which is crazy because these rockets could kill people. But, you know, Israel tolerated these drizzles of rockets like occasionally for, you know, since 2006, basically now. And that's it. Like, we can't tolerate it anymore. We can't live with this threat anymore because it went from drizzling to a deluge. And the international pressure is a problem. But I think that with the domestic support, the government can see it through. And just in terms of the domestic politics, like not just public opinion, but also the biggest party in the opposition, or the second biggest party, the opposition actually, has joined together with Netanyahu's coalition to form like what we call in Israel an emergency government. So it's sort of to show the people of the country that left and right are united in fighting this war. And so the people who are in charge of this war, it's the prime minister and the defense minister, but you also have his name's Benny Gantz, who's a former defense minister and a former IDF chief of staff and was a prominent member of the opposition, now running the war policy with Netanyahu. And I think that that's like a really important show of force, and the fact that sort of both sides of the political divide are determined to see this through.
Do you think Netanyahu's going to survive this, or when all said and done, is he going to have to leave office?
I think he's going to have to leave office. I think some people think that it's going to happen in a few months, and it's going to take longer than that, just because of the political process in Israel. It's not like in the US that when you're president, you're basically president for 4 years. It's like really, really hard to get rid of a sitting president, but it's still very difficult in Israel to get rid of a sitting prime minister. The only way I think it would happen is if members of his own coalition, right? Because in Israel, you have more than 2 parties. You have to form coalitions to have a majority in parliament. So the members of his own coalition have to be convinced to take it down. I don't think the opposition will be able to take him down from the outside. And just judging by, say, the Yom Kippur War, which was like probably the last time Israel was so taken by surprise by a war, and how long things took then, it took a few years. It took a couple of years for the prime minister to resign, and it took 4 years for the ruling party to be voted out of office. So I think that this is the beginning of the end for Netanyahu, but like, I don't think the end is in 6 months or something like that.
Okay, well, I know it's late there, so I'm going to let you go. You've been absolutely wonderful. You used to be with the Jerusalem Post. You're no longer any longer. No longer any longer. You're no longer with the Jerusalem Post. Where are you now? Where can people find you?
I'm now at Jewish Insider, which is jewishinsider.com. I'm a senior political correspondent focusing on Israeli domestic and international politics. We have a daily newsletter called the Daily Kickoff. So anyone interested in Jewish news with a political and business focus is welcome to subscribe.
You also have a Substack, don't you?
I do. I don't update it as often, but I occasionally will post my articles and sort of comments, and I guess that's where you found me talking about that article from 2019.
I did, yes, and I'm
Yeah.
glad I did. Well, Lahav Harkov, thank you so much. I hope you have a great night.
Thank you.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.